So, back again, my dear friends, to part 25 of Book of Revelation. And before we move on to the posters, we cannot get away from the Huguenots, even in Ireland. I want to show you this. This is one of the most popular magazines in Ireland every week. It's called Ireland's Own.
Lovely.
And it's a favourite magazine over the past 100 years or so. So this is dated October the 8th, 2021, last October. And it's Cavan, land of lakes. So when we turn over, it's all describing the county Cavan, which is bordering the 6 counties. We turn over here to page 5, we read this. After King Charles II was restored to the throne of England in 1660, Sir Francis Hamilton returned to Killashandra, which is a town in Cavan, and became Baron Hamilton and Member of Parliament for Cavan. With Scottish planters and Huguenot settlers, he built a market town. The persecution of Huguenots by King Louis XIV led to the Edict of Fontainebleau in 1685, also known as the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, ending recognition of Protestantism in France. Renowned for their diligence, the Huguenot refugees grew flax and made linen.
Incredible, incredible.
This magazine has nothing to do with religion.
No.
So there we are. But even that would come as news to most Irish people. I asked a friend of mine from Cavan. He's from the. I said, "Do you know much about the Huguenots?" Who are they? He said, "I don't know anything about them."
It's amazing.
It's just there's some.
They do it on purpose.
There's a really.
They do it
There's
on
a whole
purpose.
Page left blank in Irish history.
They do that on purpose.
I think they do.
It's a form of persecution to God's people.
Yeah, the high-ups, they know about it, but they
do.
don't want to teach the people.
No.
But anyway, certainly the Huguenots are not forgotten in God's book.
No.
So
certainly not.
We continue then. Again, we continue with some of the dreadful things that happened to them. Wikipedia says their Dragon Days were part of a French government policy instituted by King Louis XIV in 1681 to intimidate Huguenot families into converting to Catholicism.
Well, there you go, that's it.
This involved the billeting of ill-disciplined dragoons in Protestant households with implied permission to abuse the inhabitants and destroy or steal their property. I mean, it's bad enough to have thieves, but to actually send thieves in the name of the king himself.
So they were worse than the Black and Tans then?
Yes.
Probably just as bad. The soldiers employed in this way were spiritized as they were missionary dragoons. They were satirized, really, I should say. There were some religious missionaries, all right, weren't there? The religious and political freedoms of the witnesses were taken away. Things can die as well as people, and freedom can die. Justice can die. The Huguenots in France were vanquished as a distinct group, as a separate body. They were put to death. This was a symbolic death, whereas the St. Bartholomew's Day was a literal death. So again, we've already seen how that dead bodies and the people from different nations would look on their dead bodies in the streets. People from all tribes, tongues and nations will not allow. So that shows the huge worldwide influence that they would have. The Huguenots as a people and as a body would not be allowed to be forgotten. So we might say, should it not be body and not bodies? Was not the whole Huguenot community was just one symbolic body at this stage? They had ceased to be the one true church a long time before the revocation. However, they would still have remnants of the witnesses. That would be the true church, and witness B among them. So they could be rightly described as bodies in the plural. It's worth remembering, when they had finished their testimony, Now that tells us that they no longer testified, they no longer preached the truth. They had been preaching it, but like so many groups, they started with great enthusiasm, gradually went wrong. Different people came in, probably wanted personal power, and they had stopped preaching the true gospel. And that's really when the disaster happened then. They would not allow the Huguenots France to be put in graves. To put something in a grave is to bury it out of sight. So that they couldn't push it under the carpet. The powers of France itself and the powers of the world could not hide it. There's no better group at keeping a cause of injustice alive than a group which suffers it. And large numbers of Huguenots went as refugees to several countries after the revocation. They would have taken the story of the injustice with them and would have spread that story in their new countries. That story would have included the injustice which was still being suffered in France itself. Now, turning to the wider world, we look at the Huguenot influence in different countries. History.com on the 6th of September 2019 says, the departure of the Huguenots was a disaster for France, costing the nation much of its cultural and economic influence. In some French cities, the mass exodus meant losing half the population. Huguenots were particularly prolific in the textile industry. They were also an educated group with the ability to read and write. Many countries welcomed them and are believed to have benefited from their arrival. 4,000 settled in Berlin and are considered the spark to transform it into a major city. Other cities were keen to attract Huguenots and competed to entice them, believing that the influence of skilled, literate workers would help revive their own economies. By the time of the Exodus, beginning in 1685, Huguenot communities sprang up in Massachusetts, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina. Often, the Huguenot settlers would assimilate with existing Protestant groups. Throughout England, France, Australia, and America, remnants of Huguenot culture endure as a reminder of the Huguenot global influence. These include French Protestant churches, French names of towns and streets, as well as textile and wine making traditions. In 1924, the United States Mint commemorated the 300th anniversary of the arrival of the Huguenots in the New World with a commemorative silver coin called the Huguenot Walloon $50. Huguenots in South Africa. Wikipedia says, many people of European heritage in South Africa are descended from Huguenots. Most of these originally settled in Cape Colony but were absorbed into the Afrikaner population because they had religious similarities to the Dutch colonists. Museo Protestant website says in an article by Tristan Dalbis, the Huguenots have contributed greatly to the creation of the Afrikaner spirit, even though they were few in number. It was as if, since they could not remain French, the least they could do was to become the spearhead of the new country. In the little Huguenot museum in Franschhoek, their influence can still be seen. Here a great deal of emphasis is laid on the fact that many French names can be found in the fields of politics, finance and rugby. The book referred to here, The Huguenots of South Africa, 1688 to 1988, by Pieter Kortzezen, published by Tafelberg in Le Cap, South Africa, 1988. That then is taken from that book. Now, Huguenots in England. Independent Voices, Boyd Tonkin and Indie Voices on Friday 19th of June 2019 wrote, The Huguenot families of Spitalfields in East London were part of the great wave of French Protestant migration that transformed London and England. I mean, what a statement to make. It transformed not just London, but England. I mean, how many other foreign immigrant groups could you say that about?
Not many.
Not many.
No.
London, England, after King Louis XIV had in 1685 cancelled the civil rights granted by the Edict of Nantes, around 50,000 French Protestants came to England after King Louis revoked the 1598 Edict of Nantes at Fontainebleau in October 1685. According to some estimates, 1 in every 6 Britons has some Huguenot ancestry.
Wow.
Yes, it is easy enough to spot a Laurence Olivier, who apparently was of Huguenot descent.
Gosh.
A Simon Le Bon, of course, he was a brilliant figure, very well known. A Walter de la Mare, Daphne du Maurier, a Samuel Courtauld, a Jean Petwy, a Reginald Bosanquet, who was the newsreader, and Eddie Izzard, even a Nigel Farage. He himself claims to be of Huguenot descent.
Nigel Farage.
Nigel Farage.
Well, he's on GB News.
Is
Yes.
he? Yeah.
He's a good fellow.
He is.
He's
A good man.
He's a very
this
French.
is, this
very
is the one
French-
descended
Very
to.
intelligent
He's a
man.
very French name, isn't he? Its sheer diversity and value, argues Gregory Treasure, they must count among the most successful of immigrants to Britain. Jerry White, a leading social historian in London, confirms this. He says, "What is striking about the Huguenots was the extraordinary diversity of their manufacturing, artistic and scientific abilities. They were able to fill a huge vacuum in a country where we did not have much of those abilities here. From their famous art of silk weaving to hat making, goldsmiths, printers, paper makers, cabinet makers, jewellers, bookbinders, watchmakers. In all these areas, French expertise either kick-started or revitalised the entire range of high-skilled trades in England. Scientists and intellectuals also boosted innovation." The BBC bite-sized history series entitled "The Huguenots and Other Protestant Refugees, 1500 to 1786" says, "The Huguenots had a huge economic impact on Britain. They revitalised the silk weaving trade. They kick-started various manufacturing industries such as cutlery in Sheffield. They invested heavily in growing businesses. The skills and energies of Huguenot immigrants played an important part in transforming Britain into Europe's major industrial power. Many Huguenots joined the armed forces, with some even rising to the highest officer positions." Jim Molyneux, if turned out a fellow Irishman, SeamusDoveGold.com website says James Henry Molyneux, Baron Molyneux of Kilhead, Northern Irish Unionist, came from a family of Huguenot descent, who added, I mean, that sort of name, amazingly enough, it's common in County Wexford, but I'm surprised that I didn't change the ending of it. It's so French, isn't
It's
it?
very French.
Yeah, it's quite good. In Wexford, they tend to pronounce it Devereux.
Do they?
Yes, but I think it should be, it's, the French pronunciation is Devereux, who added much to the 18th century Belfast. James Molyneux was the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party from 1979 to 1995. Now, these two prophets have caused torment. We have to look at again how that came about. These two prophets have been a plague of the people of the world. Such a torment were these two prophets to all that dwell on the earth. Points to note, this applies to all groups who were witnesses over the whole 1200, the whole period of 1260 years. Witness A was a torment to all false religion, and witness A, of course, was the true church, preaching the true gospel. Witness B was a torment to tyrants and all who opposed religious freedom. The earth helped the woman he did what one of the witnesses had always done, that is to press for freedom. That was the role of Witness B. Many different groups were witnesses over the years since the days of Constantine. Only one witness was raised up at the French Revolution, of course, and that they were the political witnesses, the common people, so they did not, of course, include the true church. They had helped the woman. We've already seen how that worked out. It worked out, of course, by different groups from the ordinary people helping in some way. Helping the woman means that there would be in some way assisting the true church, in many cases simply to exist at all, because the true church, as I said, might well have been wiped out were it not for Witness B, Witness B fighting for them. The help the woman is actually in chapter 12. So heaven, of course, stands for the ruling class. The help the woman means that the common people would rise up in some way, assist the existence and the right to exist of the true church. Now, we'll turn now again to our fellow Christians in the days of our grandfathers and great-grandfathers and see many of them, these writers lived and wrote long before the French Revolution. So we'll see they were reading this chapter like we are, chapter 11, and they were trying to make sense of it, but we're looking to the past, but they were looking to the future, some of them, and it's really interesting to see what they expected.
Should we do that in the next section?
All right, okay.
Yeah, that was fantastic about those Huguenots.
Yeah, yes.
I mean, they're stunning people.
They are, yeah, they are.
You can tell they're one of the witnesses, can't you?
Yeah, I think they were God's special people.
They were God's
yes,
special
they were.
people.
There's no question about that. There's no other, I mean, if you think of all the other groups that came here, the Flemings came.
Why is it that the Catholic Church wanted to get rid of them?
Well, I mean, that's,
Tyrant.
you see, because the Catholic
Tyrant.
Church was if the Catholic Church had stuck to religion, they'd be fine, but they wanted political power.
Power.
Did they have political power?
Yeah.
Of course they did. But you see,
Lots.
because the Huguenots wanted to organise themselves as a political body as well, as a political party, and I think the Catholic Church said, well, no, you're not going to have it. And King Louis XIV was a mighty king of France, one of the most famous of the French king. I believe he reigned for 70 years as well. But he was really...
So he was mighty like Winston Churchill, I suppose.
Yes, but the thing
Mightier.
But the thing is that he
was a king.
but he did so much, because historians say that from the exodus of the Huguenots, France began its decline. It's not a great power now. I mean, it's
pathetic, really, isn't it?
And they're
whinging, just whinges.
I believe that, you know, there is a people, the French government, they're very unreliable. I know this.
Unreliable is the word.
I know this old soldier in he was the engineer in the Dartford Hospital, Kent. Where I was in store sport. I worked with him. I was the stationery store. So he after at the end of the war he arrived in Hamburg, I think, and he was in charge. The whole seaport was packed with sunken ships, and his job was to give the orders for the Germans to clear it up. It was all through an interpreter, of course. But he said, I never lost my admiration for them, for the Germans.
Really?
He said, I give the order, I was a foreigner, just translated, they carried it out to the letter.
Yeah.
So he said, give me a German any day before a Frenchman.
And we'll leave it at that.
Yeah.